Oliver's most dignified moment in life froze at what was supposed to be the wedding engagement of the century. Under the dazzling lights and cascading champagne, his alpha fiancé, Sebastian, heir to a top-tier financial empire, didn't slip the ring onto his finger. Instead, right in front of New York's elite, Sebastian took the hand of a frail Omega. With unbearable arrogance, he announced, "I am entirely done with this hypocritical corporate marriage. Oliver, your family is bankrupt. That nauseating stench of old money clinging to you isn't worthy of me." The whispers that erupted through the room sliced at Oliver's pride like razors. His signature crisp white tea pheromones, something he had always worn with pride, turned agonizingly bitter under the sheer humiliation. Just as he stood trembling, preparing to face this devastating ruin alone, the heavy mahogany doors of the banquet hall swung open. The sound of wheelchair tires rolling over the marble floor instantly killed the noise in the room. Tristan, Sebastian's older brother, who had been disabled in a car crash, the reclusive visionary and the true architect behind the empire, stopped right in front of Oliver. A massive wave of agarwood and whiskey pheromones swept through the hall, carrying an inescapable magnetism that instantly cleared the air. Sitting in his wheelchair, his eyes as deep as the ocean, Tristan draped a black trench coat, still carrying his body heat, over Oliver's shoulders. He looked coldly at his younger brother. "Since you don't want him, from this day forward, he is your brother-in-law." Sebastian's face flushed a deep, furious red. The sudden spike of his aggressive agave pheromones was instantly crushed into nothingness by the sheer weight of the agarwood. He clenched his fists and ground his teeth, not daring to utter a single syllable. The true power of the Redfield family rested entirely in his older brother's hands. He didn't even have the right to argue. A deathly silence fell over the room. The camera flashes went absolutely crazy, all aimed at the door. No one could believe that the man who had pulled the strings from the shadows for a decade had just publicly humiliated his own brother over a bankrupt Omega. The gland at the back of Oliver's neck burned as if pierced by searing heat. The bitter notes of his crisp white tea spilled out wildly from his collar, tangling with the rich agarwood and whiskey until his limbs felt entirely weak. He gripped the collar of the trench coat, his knuckles turning white. The unbending pride in his bones refused to accept this sudden claim. This was no different from his engagement to Sebastian, just trading him from one auction block to another. He absolutely refused to be someone else's property. He gathered his remaining strength to push Tristan's arm away, but his wrists trembled uncontrollably. Yet, Tristan's arm was as steady as a rock. His fingertips, bearing faint calluses, rested gently against the crook of Oliver's elbow. There was no crossing of boundaries, only a perfectly calculated grip to support Oliver's crumbling weight. "Let's go, Oliver," he murmured, his voice incredibly low. The glance he swept over the crowd carried a biting frost, but the moment his eyes returned to Oliver, the harshness softened. There was no showmanship, only an undeniable, grounding certainty. A private elevator took the wheelchair directly to an armored sedan waiting outside. The bodyguards carefully helped load the wheelchair, and through it all, Tristan never let go. The moment the car doors closed, the chaos and prying eyes of the outside world were entirely shut out. The overwhelming presence of the agarwood and whiskey slowly dialed back, leaving behind a steady, woody richness wrapped in just the right touch of liquor. It gently enveloped the overflowing bitterness of the crisp white tea. Leaning against the leather passenger seat, Oliver bit his lower lip, trying to hold on just long enough to make it clear that he wouldn't trade himself for financial backing. But 3 days and nights of excruciating tension had completely drained his energy in the wake of the shock and humiliation. Exhaustion crawled up his spine, and his eyelids grew too heavy to lift. The black armored sedan glided smoothly away from the Waldorf's roundabout. The warm yellow streetlights rhythmically swept across Oliver's pale, sharp profile. Right before his last shred of consciousness slipped away, the only thing he knew was the incredibly soothing scent of agarwood lingering in the air. When he finally woke up, hours had passed. The cool linen sheets clung to his sweat-dampened neck. A vaulted ceiling stretched above him, draped with dusty blue velvet canopies, while the soft glow of a crystal chandelier filtered down onto a massive wall of oak wine cabinets. This was the Redfield family's private estate, not some temporary hotel suite. He pushed himself up from the mattress. The black trench coat that had wrapped him since the Waldorf slipped from his shoulders onto the handmade wool rug, its hem still holding the faint, lingering warmth of the agarwood. Tristan's warmth, the agonizing humiliation of the engagement party still rang in his ears. Sebastian's dismissive voice, "I won't marry an Omega from a bankrupt family just to be a pretty centerpiece," still burned against his skin. The severe trauma had forcefully triggered his heat a full week early. A searing ache shot from his gland down his spine, spreading into his bones. Oliver gripped the bedsheets until they wrinkled. The corners of his eyes flushed a helpless pink from the overwhelming pressure. His normally cool, crisp white tea pheromones spiraled completely out of control, flooding the room with anxious, trembling waves. Every breath scorched his dry throat. He turned his head and reached for his suit jacket draped over the foot of the bed. Empty. His suppressants had been dropped back when Sebastian shoved him into the center of the crowd. The domineering weight of an alpha, the biological turmoil of an early heat, and the sheer disgrace of being handed off like an object all twisted together inside him. Oliver bit his lip and shrank back, burying his neck into his collar. He dug his nails into his palms to force himself to stay awake. He was not a piece of freight to be packed and shipped. Even if Tristan was Sebastian's brother, even if he was trapped on Redfield territory, he was going to negotiate. He was going to take back what belonged to the Vance family, and he would absolutely never be a pretty little bird in a cage. The bitter tang of the white tea grew thicker. Oliver had just braced his hand against the wall, trying to stand up and lock the door, when he heard a faint sound outside, the soft roll of wheelchair tires gliding over a wool runner. 3 measured knocks fell against the heavy, solid wood door. A second later, it gently pushed open. A steady wave of agarwood, mixed with the faintest hint of strong liquor, drifted through the crack, instantly pacifying the chaotic anxiety within the white tea pheromones. Tristan sat bathed in the warm light spilling in from the hallway. His deep blue silk shirt highlighted his sharp, striking features. One hand rested on his wheelchair while the other was raised, already holding a silver aluminum tube of suppressants, offering it forward. The evening light sliced diagonally through the open oak door, carrying the salty Atlantic breeze to rest on Tristan's knees. He rolled his wheelchair over the thick wool rug, the sound of the wheels as light as a feather, yet his mere presence instantly neutralized the frantic, bitter white tea crashing around the room. Oliver curled up at the head of the bed, the gland at his neck burning like molten iron. Cold sweat soaked his back, and the corners of his eyes were flushed a biological, feverish red. Still, he bit his lip, refusing to make a sound, his knuckles turning a pale, bruised blue as he gripped the duvet. This was Sebastian's family estate. This was the territory of the man who had just trampled him into the dirt. The man in front of him was Sebastian's own brother, and Oliver simply refused to believe that he had shown up out of the goodness of his heart. Tristan stopped 3 paces from the bed, coming no closer. His agarwood and whiskey pheromones were dialed back perfectly, devoid of any harsh edge. Instead, they acted like a thick, warm blanket, gently wrapping around Oliver's wildly spiraling white tea scent. Miraculously, the explosive, burning heat actually began to subside. He raised his hand. His long, articulated fingers held that silver aluminum tube of top-tier suppressant, offering it out to Oliver. Gritting his teeth, Oliver braced himself and shifted forward to take it. His fingertips trembled uncontrollably. As his burning skin accidentally brushed against the cool pads of Tristan's fingers, it was like a spark hitting dry kindling. He flinched violently, instinctively pulling back almost immediately. Tristan didn't press forward. He simply let go, placing the suppressant on the nightstand within easy reach. His voice was low and steady, without a trace of mockery or underlying intent. I'm the only resident in this entire building, and the soundproofing was built to investment bank boardroom standards. Oliver stared at the gleaming silver tube. The searing pain at the back of his neck came in stronger and stronger waves. He had fully prepared himself for an outrageous demand, for the man to ask him to trade his dignity for the suppressant. Yet the man sitting in the warm light, The metal armrests of his wheelchair gleaming coldly showed zero intention of taking advantage of his vulnerability. He bit open the packaging and pressed the suppressant into his gland. The icy medicine spread through his veins, and the out-of-control, crisp white tea slowly reigned in its frantic heat. His shoulders and back, strung tight for a full day and night, finally, involuntarily relaxed by a fraction. His pride, locked away tight for nearly a year, cracked open a hairline fracture in that moment, letting in just a slip of the warm, rich breath of agarwood and whiskey. Outside the window, the tide rose and fell. The dark blue at the edge of the sky slowly faded into a pale gray. When the first ray of morning light brushed past the heavy velvet curtains of the guest room, the familiar soft glide of wheelchair tires rolling over the rug echoed from the end of the hall, moving steadily toward the door. Oliver clenched his palms to suppress his surging emotions and spoke in a hoarse voice. "Come in." The hinges turned softly as Tristan's custom black wheelchair rolled over the threshold. The steady scent of agarwood, laced with faint liquor, drifted into the room. It felt like a warm net that refused to suffocate, utterly lacking the typical overpowering weight of an alpha. It was even more restrained and steady than when he had handed over the suppressant the day before. He didn't beat around the bush. Wheeling directly to the rosewood table by the window, his long fingers pressed down on two wax-sealed documents, sliding them smoothly across the flat surface to stop right in front of Oliver. Oliver walked up to the table. His eyes dropped to the gold-stamped Redfield family crest on the covers, and his fingertips flipped open the first page. The black ink on the paper clearly read, "Full power of attorney for the restructuring of the Vance Group." The second document was a $10 billion targeted capital injection agreement. Nowhere in the pages were there any tyrannical clauses demanding he bind himself as an Omega, require heirs, or agree to marriage. The beneficiary line was left completely, neatly blank, just waiting for his signature. "What do you want?" Oliver looked up. The corners of his eyes still held the faint red from yesterday's public humiliation, and his knuckles were white as they gripped the edge of the files. "I have nothing right now that could match this price tag, Mr. Redfield. I want a partner." Tristan's gaze landed on his face. There wasn't an ounce of frivolity, only genuine, undeniable appreciation. "I saw your report on shorting oil derivatives 3 years ago. You understand Wall Street better than the useless trash taking up space on the entire Redfield board of directors. This is a partnership, not charity. And it has absolutely nothing to do with Sebastian's ridiculous broken engagement." Oliver's tense shoulders suddenly gave way. His crisp white tea pheromones, previously tucked tightly beneath his collar, slowly seeped out, carrying a sweet resilience that followed the bitter edge. The burning pain in the gland at the back of his neck miraculously faded away almost entirely. He picked up the fountain pen. Ink flowed smoothly across the paper, and the force of his signature was perfectly steady, without a single tremor. The briefcase holding the signed documents rested at his feet. Outside the window, the estate's oak trees cast 3 full cycles of shadows. The winds of New York's Fifth Avenue swept up sycamore leaves for 3 whole months. His dormant preparations had finally reached their end. Gripping his gold-embossed M&A Director ID badge, Oliver stood outside the doors of the Transnational Energy Negotiation Room. Slipping out from beneath the door was a familiar, deeply aggressive scent of sharp agave. The edge of the gold-embossed badge dug painfully into Oliver's palm. He curled his fingers slightly, and the gland hidden beneath his suit collar suddenly flared with a biological, tingling numbness. That scent, slithering through the crack of the door, was far too familiar. It carried the undisguised domination and territorial claim of an alpha, crashing head-on into an Omega's senses. It was a blatant attempt to use innate alpha supremacy to keep him pinned down, to revel in the thrill of trampling the once untouchable ex-fiancé underfoot. Beyond the glass corridor flowed the gray-blue waters of the Hudson River. 3 months of all-night reviews and tactical planning had ground away the very last trace of anxiety in Oliver's eyes. The crisp, bitter fragrance of white tea slowly drifted from his collar, carrying the faint, sweet resilience of someone who had survived rock bottom, steadily blocking out that arrogant, spicy impact. His fingertips brushed against the leather texture of the black briefcase at his side. The upper compartment held the fully signed power of attorney for the Vance Group. The bottom layer held the energy mining rights and debt files, stapled meticulously by date. Every single page was steeped in the relentless effort of more than 3 months of sleepless nights. The hushed whispers of the junior beta assistants trailing in the hallway still drifted into Oliver's ears. Is it really him? The Omega from the bankrupt Vance family? He actually has the nerve to come and fight Sebastian for a project? I heard he latched onto Tristan. But why would an alpha actually help an outsider? It's just... The conversation inside the room abruptly ceased. The fierce agave pheromones instantly doubled in density, carrying an undisguised, mocking desire for domination. Sebastian's lazy, arrogant voice drifted through the open crack of the door. Let him in. I really want to see what kind of waves this discarded pawn can make. Oliver's Adam's apple bobbed slightly. He forced the biological discomfort deep down into his bones. The fragrance of his crisp white tea slowly sharpened. His thumb swept over his gold-embossed surname on his ID badge, and his long fingers gripped the cold door handle, turning it down with force. The bright crystal chandelier light spilled through the widening gap, landing perfectly on the sharp shoulder line of his tailored suit. At the far end of the long table, Sebastian's abruptly freezing expression crashed clearly into his line of sight, the edges of the project files on the table practically burning from the heavy agave scent. The hinges let out the faintest creak. The razor-sharp aroma of crisp white tea rushed through the opening ahead of him, forcefully carving a path right through the room thick with aggressive agave. The fragmented light of the chandelier spilled across the shoulders of Oliver's sharp, dark, gray custom suit. Carrying his black briefcase, he walked right to the empty seat of power at the head of the table, lifting his eyes to directly meet Sebastian's suddenly icy glare. Sebastian gripped his fountain pen so hard his knuckles popped. The undeniable magnetism of his fierce agave pheromones spiked to the absolute maximum, pressing down so hard that the investment board members on both sides stiffened their backs. In the front row, a beta secretary's notebook hit the cashmere carpet with a sharp smack. Oliver, Sebastian sneered, his tone dripping with the mocking thrill of supremacy. What? You managed to latch onto my older brother, and now you have the guts to try and steal my project. Oliver completely ignored the filthy accusation. He simply pressed his gold-embossed M&A director badge against the corner of the desk. One by one, he laid out the fully signed power of attorney for the Vance Group, the dated debt archives for the energy mining rights, and finally, he threw down a meticulously bound short-selling due diligence report. The sharp smack of paper hitting the wood completely drowned out Sebastian's voice. The scent of crisp white tea grew increasingly sharp, carrying the undeniable certainty of a blade that had been polished for months. Sebastian, the deep mining rights for your target, the Alaska North Slope Oil Field No. 3, were secretly mortgaged to the European Right and Bond Fund back in 2019 when you embezzled Vance assets. That debt matures this week. The fund has already initiated liquidation proceedings. The surface extraction rights you currently hold have shrunk in valuation by 72%, and they are about to be forced into auction. A deathly silence instantly choked the room. The board members scrambled to flip through the files in front of them. Every single debt voucher and mining rights division map was flawlessly clear. The overwhelming arrogance of the agave completely collapsed. Sebastian's face drained from a sickly green to a ghastly pale, his fingers trembling so badly he couldn't even hold his pen. Basking in the victory, the crisp white tea unfurled, carrying the faintest trace of sweet resilience. Oliver leaned back in his chair. His voice was perfectly calm, yet it hit the room with a deafening weight. I'm not here today to steal a project. I'm here to reclaim the Vance family's right of first refusal. By the time the meeting dispersed, heavy, dark clouds had piled up on the horizon. Oliver packed his briefcase and walked out of the office tower, just as the rain began to fall in slanted sheets. He swiped his car to enter the law firm's underground parking garage. The motion sensor lights flickered on one by one, trailing his footsteps. The sharp click of his heels against the concrete echoed loudly in the empty space. He walked to his car, but just as he pressed the key fob to unlock it, the gland at the back of his neck seized. A dense, thick wave of fierce agave, heavy with a vicious, inescapable desire for retaliation, flooded out from behind a concrete pillar, instantly enveloping his entire body. Oliver's knuckles turned white with a sudden, violent grip. The black briefcase slammed against the open car door, sending the entire stack of energy debt files spilling out. A few pages caught the rain leaking through the garage ceiling, dark gray patches blooming across the cold concrete. Sebastian stepped out from the shadows, his custom suit pressed without a single crease. His face wore a look of undisguised, vicious satisfaction. Look who it is. Wall Street's most spine-having Omega M&A director. Did you really think winning a war of words meant you could walk away with the North Slope mining rights? The spicy sting of the fierce agave drew tighter and tighter, suffocating Oliver like a heavy chain steeped in strong liquor. The biological instinct of an Omega drove his knees to near collapse, the gland at his neck burning with a violent tremor. Oliver bit down hard on the tip of his tongue to suppress the physiological shudder. His crisp white tea pheromones clashed outward with sheer pride, but they were ruthlessly crushed back into his bones by that inescapable dominating scent. The tea fragrance, which had just opened up with a sweet resilience after his victory, instantly churned into a heavy, withered bitterness, the sheer indignity of being crushed by absolute domination. Sebastian's 2 bodyguards had already completely blocked the garage exit and dismantled all the security cameras. Outside, the torrential rain smashed against the rolling metal doors, a relentless, echoing thud that pulled nerves taut. Sebastian closed the distance, stopping right behind Oliver. His rough thumb dragged viciously across the skin of Oliver's neck gland, a smile dripping with pure malice on his face. As long as I mark you today, everything you just snatched back becomes mine again. Even you. You were always just the merchandise I returned, weren't you? Oliver's fingernails dug into the car's paint, carving a deep white scratch. Crimson droplets slipped through his fingers, dampening the Vance power of attorney at his feet. He couldn't reach the emergency communicator in his suit's inner pocket. The corners of his eyes were flushed a vivid, frantic red from the biological overload, and even his fingertips trembled uncontrollably. Just as Sebastian's fangs brushed against the feverish skin of the gland, the sharp tips scraping the flesh, right at the absolute brink of piercing that thin barrier to stake an irresistible claim, a low, mechanical hum suddenly vibrated from the heavy rolling door at the garage entrance as it slowly began to rise. A flash of cold, white lightning fractured the storm-drenched darkness, and the metallic head of a silver cane caught the light, instantly commanding everyone's attention. A massive wave of agarwood and whiskey, carrying the damp chill of the thunderstorm, crashed into the enclosed garage. The spicy bite of the liquor, fueled by the terrifying domination of a top-tier alpha's sheer fury, instantly obliterated the suffocating agave. Sebastian's fangs were still lingering against Oliver's burning gland when his entire body went rigidly still. The sheer magnetism and crushing weight from the superior alpha forced him stumbling backward until his knees slammed against the car door with a dull thud. He looked up to the rising door and saw Tristan, draped in a dark gray overcoat, half his face hidden in the shadows of the entrance. Only the icy glare in his eyes shone through, more piercing than the lightning itself. Oliver's nails still gripped the car handle, scarlet drops trailing down the wood grain. His crisp white tea, previously suppressed entirely, caught that familiar, steady woody scent and helplessly leaked a heavy, withered note. The pride he had held together for nearly half an hour fractured the moment that overwhelming aura, one meant only to crush others, settled over the room. His fingertips shook so violently, he could barely hold on to the rain-stained mining files against his chest. "Older brother, what are you doing here?" Sebastian's voice trembled. His fierce agave had shrunk until barely a trace remained. He couldn't believe that Tristan, who had always remained behind closed doors and out of the fray, would actually step forward for this Omega. "This is a private matter between him and me. You shouldn't. Since when did my partner become your private matter?" Tristan rolled his wheelchair forward. The silver cane struck the ground with a force that sent tremors through the concrete. "I have already notified the board. Effective immediately. All your family privileges are suspended. Your trusts and project shares are frozen. Wait for the press conference announcing your expulsion." All color instantly drained from Sebastian's face. He collapsed into the puddles, utterly speechless, as the bodyguards moved in to drag him out of the garage. Tristan wheeled himself right up to Oliver. He leaned forward, opening his own overcoat, and steadily caught the trembling man in his arms. His searing breath brushed the top of Oliver's hair. The warmth of the agarwood wrapped tightly around the numb back of Oliver's neck, while the sharp edge of the whiskey completely shielded him from the front. "It's over, Oliver," he said softly, taking the crumpled mining files from Oliver's desperate grip, his fingertips gently brushing over the injured scarlet-stained knuckles. "We're leaving." The customized black sedan crushed through the flooded streets of Wall Street, heading straight for the Redfield estate. Pressed tightly against Tristan's warm chest, the searing heat from the gland on the back of Oliver's neck had already spread past his jawline. A biological fever was slowly crawling up his spine, melting into his entire body. The stretched black sedan glided past the ivy-covered stone walls of the Redfield estate. Raindrops lashed fiercely against the roof, and the tires carved through puddles, sending sprays of silver water high into the air. Tristan maneuvered his wheelchair and personally pushed open the doors to the master bedroom. The servants waiting in the hallway caught one breath of the overwhelming pheromones churning inside the room and instantly held their breath, lowering their heads. They quickly pulled the doors shut and retreated, sealing out the storm and the rest of the world completely. The cashmere blanket wrapped around Oliver slipped onto the handmade wool rug. Unable to hold his tense body upright any longer, he collapsed halfway into the massive bed, sinking into the silk sheets. His suit was drenched from the freezing rain, and the severe shock of Sebastian's attempted marking had served as the final catalyst. His heat, already simmering just beneath the surface, exploded completely. The gland at the back of his neck burned so hot, it felt like it would sear right through the thin fabric of his shirt. A biological fever crawled up his spine and spread into his bones, leaving him trembling uncontrollably. Yet, locked tightly between his fingers was that rain-stained, crumpled roll of mining rights files, the core evidence he needed to tear Sebastian down. Even with his mind on the verge of shattering, he refused to loosen his grip by a single fraction. The master bedroom was quickly flooded with an impossibly thick, crisp white tea. The original bitterness had been softened by the intense heat, leaving an intoxicatingly sweet undertone that slowly drifted through the air. Tristan rolled his wheelchair forward, stopping exactly 3 paces from the bed. His long, articulated fingers rested on the armrests, and only the faint throbbing of a vein at the side of his neck betrayed his composure. His steady agarwood unfurled first, firmly wrapping around the surging white tea, completely suffocating the last lingering traces of the fierce agave until they vanished without a trace. Oliver buried his face into the plush pillows, his shoulders heaving violently. A frantic, feverish flush bloomed at the corners of his eyes, and the sheer biological heat blurred his damp eyelashes. The swollen gland at the back of his neck burned gently beneath his collar. His pheromones poured out in increasingly potent waves, tangling with the agarwood and drifting deliberately toward the alpha. The air in the entire room turned thick and searing. Tristan's Adam's apple bobbed hard. The whiskey scent, buried so deep for so long, finally surged upward uncontrollably, rushing up his spine and tearing through his body. An instinct suppressed for years shattered all defenses, guided by the sweet, pliant pheromones of the Omega. His knuckles gripped the armrest tighter and tighter until they turned pale. A silver-blue flash of lightning tore past the floor-to-ceiling windows, perfectly illuminating that rain-stained, fiercely crumpled roll of mining files on the bedroom rug, its edges frayed from being gripped so hard. Outside, the storm continued to batter the glass. Inside, the room was encased in a surging heat. Sebastian's residual agave had long been obliterated, while Oliver's searing white tea seeped into every crack and crevice of the room. The faintly bitter tea, laced with the physiological fever, was already steadily caught by Tristan's deep, grounding agarwood. Only the whiskey, suppressed for 3 long years, seeped uncontrollably from his bones. That spicy, intoxicating warmth slowly began to curl around the burning gland at the back of Oliver's neck. Oliver propped himself up halfway against the headboard, his hands twisting the ivory silk sheets into permanent creases. He couldn't suppress the tremors racking his body. The gland was so hot it felt like molten fire against his skin. His consciousness had long been washing away under the tidal wave of the heat, yet that unyielding pride carved into his bones forced his eyes to stay open. The corners of his eyes were a stained rouge like red, and his lips were bitten open. A salty, metallic tang spread across his tongue, mixing with the bitter tea. Clinging to his last shred of sanity, he hadn't forgotten the evidence he held, hadn't forgotten his vow to take back everything that belonged to the Vance family. But the sheer biological craving was already tearing his defenses to pieces. Tristan remained in his wheelchair, exactly 3 paces from the bed. His knuckles gripping the armrest had turned a deathly white. The vein pulsing at the side of his neck was frantic, and his Adam's apple bobbed again and again. He had seen this Omega standing sharply at a Wall Street negotiation table, radiating absolute brilliance. He had harbored a silent love for 3 entire years, ever since the first time he watched this young man pry open a corporate titan's defenses with just 3 reports. What he wanted was never an opportunistic claim. He wanted no part in an alpha's innate entitlement to plunder an Omega. The metal axle let out the faintest creak under the force of his grip. A hoarse question finally squeezed past his tightly pressed lips. Every single word was drenched in the inescapable magnetism of agarwood and whiskey, so intense it sent a tingling burn through Oliver's ears. "Oliver, are you—" Oliver's eyelashes trembled violently. Hot tears rolled over his searing cheekbones and slipped into his collar. His curled fingers slowly released the crumpled sheets, lifting up and reaching out toward the hand Tristan had resting on the armrest. Oliver's fingertips hovered in the air. His scorching breaths made the very air tremble, and the teardrops falling from his lashes hit the cashmere rug, blooming into small, damp circles. Tristan swallowed hard. His knuckles were bruised pale from how fiercely he gripped the chair, and the vein on his neck pulsed like it might burst through his skin. The steady anchor of the agarwood desperately tried to hold down the crashing waves of whiskey. Yet he still didn't dare to move. He only repeated, his voice utterly wrecked, "Oliver, be absolutely sure. I won't lay a hand on someone who doesn't want to wake up." He bit down on his broken lip once more. The metallic taste, tangled with the now sweetening white tea, flooded the room entirely. Oliver stumbled a half-step forward. His legs gave out completely, sending him falling directly into the warm, fragrant sanctuary surrounding Tristan. He turned his burning neck, fully exposing the melting, feverish gland at the nape. Lifting his wet lashes, his gaze collided straight into Tristan's deep ink-black pupils. He reached out, grabbed Tristan's wrist, and piece by piece he guided that hand, the one that had held back for 3 long years, until it rested firmly over his own scorching gland. The whiskey scent, locked away for 3 years, instantly shattered its restraints. Blended with the profound weight of the agarwood, it securely caught the frantic, crashing white tea. The withered bitterness that had been steeped in indignity slowly bled out into a profound sweetness. The tea intertwined with the wood and liquor, twisting into an inseparable knot in the dead of the night. Tristan's teeth rested gently against the gland. There was no authoritative plunder typical of an alpha, only a soothing, careful bite. His pheromones slowly seeped into the shallow graze, leaving a gentle but unmistakable temporary mark. Oliver trembled violently. The knuckles of the hand gripping Tristan's suit cuff turned bone white, his hot tears burying into the man's knee. He had finally allowed himself to strip away all his armor, landing safely in the arms of someone willing to wait for his consent. On the low cabinet in the corner, under the glow of the table lamp, that rain-stained, frayed, and crumpled stack of Vance mining files quietly revealed its beige edges. 1 month later, the morning rush-hour traffic of Lower Manhattan rolled over the damp asphalt, carrying the caramelized aroma of the corner coffee stand. Outside the New York Stock Exchange, a black umbrella cast a small pool of shade over 2 men in custom suits. Their voices were kept incredibly low, but beneath the enclosed canopy of the umbrella, their pheromones swirled together inextricably. The crisp white tea mingled with the deep, grounding, woody notes of agarwood, trailing off with the faintest hint of whiskey. Ever since that temporary mark a month ago, the sense had melted into a single, inseparable entity, never to be untangled again. Investment bank interns brushing past them kept turning their heads, their eyes holding that specific, ambiguous scrutiny unique to the gossip circles of top-tier financial empires. Oliver had long grown used to those looks. His fingertips gripped the Vance mining rights files, his knuckles turning slightly white from the force. He was the first to break the silence. The board just sent out a notice. Next week, they're launching a comprehensive compliance audit of the new M&A department. It was initiated by those old board members who are in Sebastian's pocket. They're obviously trying to kick me out. A trace of withered, anxious bitterness unconsciously bled into the crisp white tea. Almost immediately, the steady anchor of the agarwood drifted over, gently wrapping around that bitter edge and firmly catching his spiraling emotions. Oliver's atoms apple-bobbed. He didn't shy away from piercing the ugliest of the rumors, his voice as cold as the marble countertops in an investment bank lobby. The whole of Wall Street is going crazy with the rumors. They're saying I won the energy case by climbing into your bed. They're saying the mastermind behind Redfield threw it all away just for an Omega's pheromones. Tristan sat in his custom carbon fiber wheelchair, a silver gray cane resting casually against the armrest. His tailored dark gray trousers fell perfectly over his knees. He didn't show an ounce of anger at the words. Only the whiskey notes wrapped within the agarwood deepened slightly, carrying a quiet, undeniable domination. His gaze lingered on Oliver's tense jawline and the faint flush at the tips of his ears. His long fingers slowly moved to the black leather briefcase resting on his lap. His thumb brushed over the cool, embossed metal clasp, and his fingers slowly curled inward. Click. The cool metal clasp popped open. The flap of the black leather briefcase slid slowly down Tristan's knee, revealing a stack of yellowed, stapled manuscript pages and a thick document stamped with the Redfield family crest. The midday sun of Fifth Avenue slanted down, illuminating the messy handwritten notes on the pages. It was Oliver's speech draft from a closed-door Morgan summit 3 years ago. The edges still bore the light brown stain of the iced coffee he had knocked over back then, as clear as if he had just written it yesterday. The fingers Oliver had pressed tightly against the seam of his trousers suddenly went rigid. The crisp white tea wavered in sheer surprise. The red flush at the tips of his ears slowly spread. He had thought of that summit 3 years ago as nothing more than a junior analyst's mandatory appearance. He never imagined that the reclusive architect of the Redfield Empire would remember it to this day. 3 years ago, I sat in the front row listening. Tristan's voice was incredibly low. He tapped his finger lightly against the cover of the manuscript, and the wheels of his custom wheelchair shifted a half-inch on the pavement. You used half a sticky note to completely corner 3 oil tycoons. That was when I remembered you. It wasn't some predestined biological match. What I remembered was the way you looked when you said, capital should never treat people as collateral. He pushed the gold-stamped shareholder proxy agreement in front of Oliver. The overwhelming magnetism of the agarwood and whiskey settled heavily, carrying an unquestionable authority. The outside world says you traded your body to get to the top. Well, I'm going to shove the truth into the face of all of Wall Street. The partner I, Tristan Redfield, chose was never chosen for his biology. He was chosen for his sheer brilliance. I am transferring all 17% of my liquid Redfield shares to your name, granting you full power of attorney to represent me. Across the street, a flash of light bounced off the window of a paparazzi van. They had clearly captured the Redfield crest on the briefcase and the open manuscript. Tristan never intended to hide this from the very beginning. Oliver's fingertips brushed against the cool gold foil of the proxy agreement. The sweet resilience of his tea scent slowly seeped out, tangling beautifully with the agarwood and whiskey in front of him. Early the next morning, the Manhattan winds swept the scent of coffee straight into the lobby of the Redfield Tower. Under the hands of the attendants, the heavy solid wood doors of the top-floor boardroom slowly swung open. The brilliant light of the gilded crystal chandelier crashed down, and a room full of prying, filthy gazes immediately pinned themselves on Oliver. The rumors that had haunted Wall Street for the past month had fully permeated the top-floor boardroom. Every single stare seemed to say that this Omega from a ruined family had merely slept his way onto Tristan's mattress in exchange for a shiny new suit. Oliver's back was as straight as it had been 3 years ago on the Morgan Summit stage. The crisp, bitter scent of white tea spread out, carrying an undisguised, razor-sharp edge. His fingertips gripped the gold-stamped Redfield proxy agreement. His heels clicked against the polished marble floor as he walked straight to the seat reserved for the largest independent shareholder and sat down. In the wheelchair beside the head of the table, Tristan rested his fingertips on the armrest. The deep, grounding pheromones of agarwood and whiskey rolled out steadily like an invisible net, firmly catching Oliver's radiating tea fragrance. There was zero aggression, only an unspoken, absolute backing. "You think you deserve to sit there?" Sebastian slammed the table and shot up from his chair. The spicy sting of his fierce agave pheromones pressed forward, dripping with innate alpha arrogance. His face twisted with its usual wild entitlement. "An Omega I played with and tossed aside has the guts to come and steal a seat at the Redfield table?" Oliver didn't even spare him a glance. He raised his hand and tossed a meticulously bound stack of files right into the center of the long table. The sharp smack of paper made the senior board members jump. Sebastian, embezzling $300 million in Vance Mining liquidity in 2019. Misappropriating family funds on 5 separate occasions between 2021 and 2023. Colluding with Qatari foreign capital to short domestic new energy. Every single transaction record, every single agreement bearing your signature is right here. The crisp white tea suddenly turned violently sharp, completely crushing the hollow bravado of the fierce agave. A collective gasp erupted through the room. The senior directors flipped through the evidence, their fingers trembling. Colluding with foreign capital was the one absolute, untouchable red line of the Redfield family. Sebastian's face instantly drained to a deathly pale. His agave pheromones wavered and collapsed into a pathetic mess. He lunged forward, desperately trying to tear the evidence apart, but the security detail at the door was already on him, gripping his wrists and escorting him out of the room. The vote passed unanimously. Sebastian was stripped of all inheritance rights and exiled from the family. The boardroom quickly emptied, leaving only Oliver and Tristan. The sweet undertone of the crisp white tea slowly spilled out, trailing along the edge of the table to intertwine with Tristan's agarwood and whiskey. The two scents had long since melted into each other, impossible to tell apart. Tristan turned his wheelchair, the silver wheels gliding over the spotless marble, and stopped right by Oliver's side. He reached out his hand, his palm rough with warm calluses. His ink-dark eyes held the exact same undeniable appreciation they had carried for 3 years. "Let's go. To the place that belongs to you." A deep dent remained in the marble floor where Sebastian had knocked over his mahogany chair. The dispersing board members didn't dare breathe too loudly, their footsteps as light as cats, no one daring to look back at the two men by the long table. Oliver looked down at the hand offered to him. The long, articulated fingers and the familiar, warm calluses were exactly the same as they were 3 months ago when they had handed him the suppressant. He didn't hesitate. He placed his hand directly into Tristan's, his fingers locking tight. He didn't say a single word of thanks. They had been equal partners from the very beginning. There was never any need for the gratitude of charity. The soft glide of wheels against the corridor's marble faded away, eventually replaced by the steady, mechanical hum of the elevator car. 30 days later, in Lower Manhattan. On the 42nd floor of the newly restructured Vance Energy headquarters, Oliver stood before a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Between his fingertips, he held the freshly signed asset handover confirmation. The setting sun over the Hudson River dyed the tips of his hair a pale gold. The familiar searing heat bloomed from the gland at the back of his neck. The crisp white tea, laced with an intoxicatingly sweet resilience, drifted from his collar, colliding perfectly with the agarwood and whiskey as the door pushed open. Just like countless late nights before, they naturally tangled together, melting into an inseparable whole. Tristan rolled his wheelchair in, stopping right behind him. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected their overlapping silhouettes. Oliver was just about to bring up next week's Middle Eastern M&A deal when he heard the faintest creak from the wheelchair's armrests. He whipped his head around. He saw Tristan gripping the armrests, his back slowly straightening, his long legs planting firmly onto the cashmere rug. 7 years. Ever since that car crash, Tristan had never stood up. Oliver's breath caught violently in his throat. The corners of his eyes instantly flushed red, and his crisp white tea pheromones rippled with a subtle, overwhelming tremor. Tristan took step after steady step until he stood right in front of him. He reached into his suit's inner pocket and pulled out a velvet box. He popped it open. A platinum ring, embedded with the Redfield crest, rested against the black velvet. The band was tailored perfectly to Oliver's size. I spent 7 years in physical therapy, and it wasn't just to return to the center of the family. He lowered his head. His scorching breath swept across the gland at the back of Oliver's neck, the gland that already bore his mark. The intoxicating warmth of the whiskey wrapped flawlessly around the agarwood. I also wanted to stand up so I could put this ring on the person my soul chose. With a firm, deliberate push, he slid the ring down to the base of Oliver's ring finger. The sunset spilled over their joined hands. The crisp white tea and the agarwood-laced whiskey intertwined inextricably. Carried by the Manhattan evening breeze slipping through the window cracks, it brought a long-delayed freedom that belonged entirely to the two of them, slowly rippling out into the golden-red dusk of the city.
And that brings our story to a close. What moves me most about this tale of betrayal, retaliation, and mutual salvation isn't the conventional push and pull of pheromones, but the deep-seated pride and profound restraint carved into the very bones of both protagonists. Faced with his family's bankruptcy, the public humiliation of a broken engagement, and even the biological chaos of an early heat, Oliver never yielded for a single second. The sheer composure he showed in driving his enemy into a corner, relying entirely on pure intellect, ruthless strategy, and relentless, sleepless effort, is nothing short of breathtaking. He proved through his actions that true power lies in capital and capability, not in biology or arranged marriages. Tristan, on the other hand, demonstrated what it truly means to be an apex alpha. He possessed absolute power and an inescapable magnetism, yet he offered Oliver the ultimate, most profound respect. He never fell in love with some biologically compatible scent. He fell for the brilliant business prodigy who single-handedly cornered the elite at that summit 3 years ago. In the torrential rain of the parking garage, he descended like a guardian to shield Oliver. Yet, during the overwhelming fever that followed, he still gritted his teeth and held back his every instinct, waiting until Oliver willingly took his hand. This kind of love, built entirely on soulful resonance and absolute equality, is infinitely more powerful than any instinctual, involuntary tether. I hope everyone out there finds a love as beautiful as this. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.